Tonight I will be sharing 6 stories. Stories involving other planes of existence, monsters, ghosts, and the unexplained. At least one of these stories are bound to send a chill up your spine. A huge thank you to the writers for allowing me to share their stories. Remember, you can send in your own story to rylhstories@gmail.com. Please remember to drop a like if you enjoy, as it helps out the channel in a real way. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. You ever stare into a mirror for a long time? Lacey asked out of the blue. No, I said, and continued aimlessly scrolling through the Netflix catalog. You have to try it. Lacey burst and clasped her hands together. She jumped up off the sofa and stood in front of me, her eyes brimming with excitement. It wasn't unlike her to get excited over the little things. She was a ball of energy. I was a bit of the opposite. I was the mellow one, the cynical one, though I prefer the term realist. Why? I asked. I mean, what could be interesting about staring into a mirror? Narcissistic, if you ask me. Oh, Brooke, don't be such a downer. Me and my sisters used to do it all the time as kids. It's interesting. You'll see. I don't know. Sounds boring. I tried to hide my smile. I wanted to tease her a little more, but her bubbly excitement and the gleam in her eyes had rubbed off on me, as it did often. I was always happy for that. Don't be like that, Brooke. I see you smiling. Come on. She grabbed both my hands, pulled me up, and dragged me toward the bathroom. What happens? I asked. You'll see. Lacey told me to wait while she got some candles. It's better in dim light, she said when she came back. She set up one candle on either side of the rectangular mirror, lit them, then stepped to the side. You first, she said. I stood in front of the mirror and stared at myself for a moment, then turned to her confused. So, what do I do? It's easy, she said. Just stare at yourself, right into your own eyes. Don't move and don't glance away, not even a little. Okay. It seemed silly at first, just staring at myself. But it did not take long for things to feel a little eerie. The sense of self started to drip away, as if the reflection were made of wax, and the person staring back at me in the mirror could almost be considered a statue, or imitation, not a true reflection. Then my features started to vanish. First my mouth was gone, then my nose, and then my eyes. I found myself staring at a blank face, and that was enough for me. Whoa, I said. I clenched my eyes shut and shook my head. What did you see? My face. It went black. Creepy, right? She laughed. Yeah, you could say that. I noticed goose flesh had broken out all over my arms. I had a sudden, odd sense that we were playing around with things we should not be. That what we were doing was much more than just a simple game, but the feeling passed quickly. Lacey, as if noticing my worry, placed a comforting hand on my back and looked at me with those soft, expressive hazel eyes of hers. Don't worry, she said. I know why it does that. It's just our brains filtering out stimuli that doesn't change or move. It's just how our brain works. Oh, makes sense. Anyway, my turn. I'm kind of excited. Reminds me of home again. Playing with my sisters before we all moved out and moved on with our lives. The good old days. Lacey positioned herself in front of the mirror, and I stepped to the side. I stood beside her and to the right, in a position where I could see her reflection, but not my own. You know, Lacey began, if you stare at your blank face long enough, it starts to morph. You see completely random people in the reflection. Seriously? Why does that happen? I think it's your brain freaking out for staring at something blank for so long. It needs stimuli, you know? Or we'd go insane. So I guess it makes its own and morphs our reflection into something. Anything. Oh yeah. Again, makes sense, I said. Then I said something I would come to regret for the rest of my life. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was Lacey's idea. Not that that would bring her back. But at least it would lift the crushing guilt off my heart. The grief is bad enough, but the guilt is like the point of sun through a magnifying glass. Sharp and burning it away. But there was no use trying to trick myself. It was my idea. I had said it. Have you ever tried this in the dark? Lacey turned to me with a gasp. her eyes wide with excitement. No, that'd be interesting. Before I could say any more, she blew out the candles. The room went dark, the only light coming from the dancing bluish colors off the television down the hall, and the pale moonlight creeping around the edge of the window curtain. I looked at Lacey in the mirror. Her face was in shadow, but her eyes shimmered silvery from the small bit of moonlight. We stood in silence for some time. I watched the mirror, strangely enthralled. Lacey stood still like a statue. Then it started to happen. The mirror changed. It was subtle, but I saw the mirror start to waver, like the reflective glass had become a body of water, a pond. Lacey's dark face warped in the fluid reflection. Her eyes went black, the light in them extinguished. A darkness spread out from her face, clouding outward like black dye dropped in water. It started to cover the entire mirror, hiding the reflection of our dim, palely lit bathroom. I opened my mouth to say something, but found I could not speak. I tried to walk toward the light switch, but found I could not move. Even my eyes were frozen in place, stuck in a trance, staring into the impossibly black ink that spread through the mirror. The darkness spread to the edges and spilled over into our world. It consumed the room around me, eating it away like a cancerous growth. I could see Lacey in my periphery get swallowed by the darkness. I tried to scream out for her, but no sound would escape my throat. My world became the darkness. The sensation of the cold tile beneath my feet vanished. The sounds of the cars passing by outside were gone. I was buoyed by a sensation of complete weightlessness. I tried to move my arms, my legs, anything, but I could not feel them. They did not exist in there. Nothing existed in there. No sight, no sound, no feeling, no nothing. It was as if the mirror had become absorptive instead of reflective, and had sucked my mind into an abyss, into nothing, pure nothing. I was floating in a vast empty space, devoid of anything and everything. It was utter madness, a prison for the mind, with nothing for stimuli, nothing to look at, hear, feel, or focus on, not even my own breaths. I knew my mind would eat itself like a starved man turned cannibal. I could think of only one thing to do. When I was young, I suffered from sleep paralysis. When I would wake up, frozen and numb, and a crushing weight on my chest, I would focus on wiggling my index finger. If I could just do that, I would break free of the sleep paralysis. So in that abyss, I focused on wiggling my finger. It was strange at first, not being able to feel my finger at all, but I kept trying. If I could just wiggle it a little. I began to feel something slight, a sensation that my finger was there, but only as a cloud of mist, a suggestion of something instead of the actual thing. The movement felt sluggish, but the sensation built, and finally, I could feel my finger as I should. I wiggled it in the dark, and the feeling flooded back, first to my other fingers, then to my hand, and then to my arm. It felt heavy. I wrenched it upward, and graciously the world came crashing back. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. I got up, scrambled to the wall, and groped for the light switch. I squinted against the harsh fluorescent light, and looked at Lacey. It was too late for her. She stood in front of the mirror, shoulders slack and her head slightly cocked to the side. Her mouth hung agape, and drool was creeping down her chin. Her eyes were dull and glazed over. Vacant. Gone. I shook her. I screamed and cried and yelled. I even slapped her. She did not respond. I don't know why I broke free, yet she couldn't. Maybe it's because I wasn't staring directly into my face like she was. Maybe it's because I knew about the sleep paralysis trick, and she did not. Either way, she lays in a hospital to this day, stuck in her comatose state. The doctors don't know what happened to her. It's like nothing they've ever seen, they say. But I know. I know what happened. I have not told anyone. I fear they would not believe me. I'm sure they would only call me insane. But I know what happened. I know that complex, bubbly, and lively mind is lost where I was lost. Floating somewhere in that eternal abyss, that prison for eternity, stuck in that torture chamber of endless nothingness, her mind rotting. So, her body just lies there, in her hospital bed, comatose and wasting away, kept alive by machines. Her eyelids stuck open, and worst of all, her eyes, her once expressive, loving eyes, now glazed over and empty, forever. I wish I could sleep. I really do. I don't want to say I have insomnia because I never went for tests, and self-diagnosis can lead you down a rabbit hole I dare not venture. But still, sleep eludes me. It started in high school, I guess. I was on a normal teenage sleep schedule and would regularly amass 6 to 8 hours, and that was plenty. In college, it became erratic, and I'd sometimes sleep for 12 hours, and occasionally, not for days. It wasn't until after college that it became a problem, though. Skipping classes was no big deal, to me at least, but soon I was in the real world. I had a job, a girlfriend, and just generally people who depended on me. I couldn't wait till 3 in the morning, and then sleep until noon anymore. I had to change. I assumed it was stress at first. Not knowing what to expect from life can eat away at the psyche of anyone, but especially someone who brings a multitude of pre-existing mental issues to the table. At first, though, I wore it as a badge of pride. Yeah, I would internally proclaim to the world. I get 0 to 3 hours of sleep and can still function in society, so suck on that. But my mental state and physical health quickly began to erode as the lack of sleep began taking its toll. Sleeping pills were the solution, of course. Just some over-the-counter stuff, because when in doubt, medicate, I thought. They worked wonders too, for a time. My few hours ballooned to 6 or 7, and it was wonderful. But as my body got used to the meds, their effect lessened. 7 turned back to 1, and the 2 pills became 3, then 4, then 6. But no matter how many I took, nothing more happened. Until eventually I stopped taking them altogether, just hoping to avert any extra damage I was doing by taking so many. Eventually, I wasn't sleeping at all. No matter how hard I wanted to, or tried, I'd lay in bed with my eyes closed, listening to the creaks and groans of the house that used to keep me up as a child, but now were my only companions on my slow treks through the night. I would listen to them hard and intently, almost trying to hypnotize myself, until one night, another sound accompanied them, a soft scratch followed by a tap. I mean, the house made sounds my whole life, and to this day, I can't explain, so I wasn't too worried, but soon enough, they became more persistent. They started in the hall, and then migrated under my bed, and then next to it. This is all it was, for days or weeks. Tiny little sounds. I didn't open my eyes or turn on the lights, just assuming it was either the house or lack of sleep. I tried more medicine. Different medicine. I tried to meditate, but still nothing. Still, I had to listen to the sounds of my house settling that were now all but drowned out by the persistent scratching and tapping that echoed through my room. It wasn't long before other, more ominous noises filled the air. Low growls at first, then demonic, sickly screams. Shrieks of pain and sick sadistic pleasure haunted my mind during the days that I spent dreading the night. But night would always come, and with it, more sounds. I assumed at this point that I was hearing another place, a darker place. I thought I was hearing hell. Between the terrible screams and pleas for mercy, always accompanied by demonic snarls that sent shivers down my spine. I didn't open my eyes or cover my ears. I didn't feel in danger, just annoyed. It was a nuisance, but not a dangerous one as far as I could tell. One fateful night though, I went to bed as I normally do. My room was burning up, despite having made sure I cranked the AC as much as I could. I closed my eyes and waited for the noise to start, but they didn't. I heard nothing. It was more terrifying than the screams that usually permeated the air. I heard nothing, but I felt something. It was small at first, but then I realized it was breath on my cheek. A hot, disgusting breath that smelt of death and rot. I was focusing on the breath when I felt a weight on my chest and something sharp digging into my skin. I tried not to react. I tried hard to feign sleep, even as sticky liquid dripped onto my mouth. The breath on my cheek grew faster and faster, and whatever was on my chest was now mirroring it, with breath on my face. I wanted to vomit or scream, but I didn't even dare open my eyes, believing that was the only thing keeping me alive. I think my gaze would have condemned me. I think my eyes were an invitation to whatever hellish game they wanted to play, so I kept them shut. The creature near my cheek began growling low and steady, until the creature on top screamed a high-pitched scream in my face. They wanted something to go on, but I gave them nothing. At this point, not even knowing if I could move if I wanted to. Eventually the pressure on my chest was relieved, and the breath was gone. I wept softly, slowly opening my eyes to see the sun rising. I realized now that I was in their territory. The night was their domain. I realized there are things that lurk in the dark, always watching, waiting for their invitation. They don't like to be seen. That fateful night was yesterday. I have a bottle of pills, and I pray they work because I can't handle another night. God only knows what they have in store for me. I just knew I had to get this out there, to post it somewhere, because I know if this goes on, I will succumb. I just wish I could sleep. Today, while I was at the checkout of Jim's grocery store, Jim's eye fell out of his socket. It hit the counter with a wet splat, then rolled onto the floor. Jim didn't even notice. He just kept packing away my cans with that same vacant stare. My town shares its tragic history with a lot of rural communities. At one point, we were a small, thriving city of a few thousand people. It was perfect. Small enough to feel like a community, but large enough to have a sturdy economy. Most people were farmers who, admittedly, had tough lives, given the region's harsh climate. You never heard anybody complain, though. They were just happy to provide for their families and contribute what they could to the city. All of that changed in about a 5-year period. Harsh, sweltering, and painfully long droughts reduced most people's farms to nothing but scorched earth. At the same time, a highway was built about 10 kilometers away, which completely cut off any outside traffic. These two factors essentially spelled our death. People, especially families, started to leave in droves. Eventually, only those of us who were too old or stubborn were left behind. Like I said, it's a pretty common story. I'm not sure when the unnatural part of this all started. Looking back, I think it was a slow process. Our community had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. In the old days, I had been met with the sound of children's laughter and the friendly nods of neighbors whenever I walked down the street. Now, it seemed that everyone was too tired and bitter to bother with neighborly pleasantries, myself included. We felt cheated of what we had always known. In some cases, I'm sure this would bring the few remaining people in a city closer together. For some reason, though, this resentment festered in the community and began to rot it from the inside. I remember when I first noticed somebody starting to decay. Ed, the only mechanic who had managed to stay open, seemed to have lost half his teeth since I'd been in for my last service. When I walked in, he rolled out from under another vehicle, and when he greeted me, I mostly saw gum. One of his oil-stained sleeves was rolled up, and a chunk of flesh was missing from his forearm. I didn't say anything, chalked it up to old age and a drinking habit. After that, I paid closer attention to those around me and started to notice more. Edna, our local butcher, was missing her left pinky finger. Albert, the proprietor of our little cafe, had a strange, angry-looking rash on one side of his face. At the same time, the buildings were starting to fall apart too. Windows would fall and shatter on the ground from just the slightest breeze. The roads quickly developed an alarming amount of potholes. One day, when I was taking my evening stroll, I saw that the wall of two of my neighbors, the Ridleys, had completely collapsed. They sat at their dining room table inside, exposed to the world, but didn't even seem to notice. I called out to them, asking if they needed any help covering up the hole. They just sat there for a long time, staring at the table. Finally, they turned to look at me, silently. Ridley's lower jaw hung open slackly, and a bloated, purple tongue rested against his chin. Janet was missing clumps of her hair, and the skin seemed to be sagging off her face. Both of them just sat there, looking in my direction, completely oblivious. At the sight of them, I stumbled back, my head reeling. These were people I had known for decades. We walked to church together on Sunday morning, before the priest moved away. Janet and my late wife loved going for long bike rides together on summer evenings. I had no idea what to do, considering that there were no doctors, nurses, or even vets in town. I couldn't even drive anywhere, considering that Ed had completely vanished before he'd put my car back together. I walked in through the hole in their wall and approached the table. They continued to stare out into the night, not taking any notice of me. When I reached the table, I shook Janet's shoulder to try and break her stupor. With a sickening snap, her head fell off her shoulders and landed with a thud at my feet. I lurched backwards and fell to my knees. Joe slowly turned to look at his wife's decapitated head, then went back to staring at the table. Almost everyone is gone now. The worst part is, while they're still alive, they just go about their daily routines as if nothing is wrong. I saw the mayor dragging himself along the ground to his office, with his legs trailing behind him limply. His stomach was bloody and raw from being pulled along the road, and he left a sticky, red trail behind him. Somehow, I miraculously managed to stay relatively unscathed throughout all this. I'm glad my body is still largely intact, but I wish my mind had withered away like everyone else's. I've tried to get away before, to go and find help, but it's impossible. Everybody's car has been reduced to a pile of rusted metal on the street, and I'm far too old to make the journey on foot in this oppressive heat. I think I'm doomed to stay here, and watch as everything and everyone I've ever known shrivels away like an apple on a sunny summer's day. About 2 months ago, I moved close to a massive park in one of the bigger cities in the southwest United States. I'm not going to say which, not only because I want to keep some level of anonymity here, but also because I don't want to encourage anyone from looking into this any further. I just need to tell someone about this. Bit of background on this one. I'm from a small town about an hour north of Philly, grown up around woods and loved being in them. Would get lost in them only to see if I could find a way back to my house on my own. Made some paths of my own. Really found myself in the calm of nature, as motivational posts as that may sound. Was also not a stranger to them once the sun went down. Walked through them at night with friends to get to and from parties around town faster. Always on my trails because they're the best. Hidden them countless times from cops or people after us for playing the usual small town prank on a house. Heard that awful noise of a deer that it makes when it's hissing in the absolute black out there. At night, they're trees and leaves to me. Nothing more. So when moving from a kinda sketchy part of the city closer to the park, I was thrilled. Hell, there aren't any houses on the other side of the street from me. It's a trailhead that opens for a few good miles of woods. I'm back to being able to lose myself while still being able to live a city life. Win-win all around. That was until last night. It was a little past 3 in the morning. First time being up this late since I moved in because the job I just finished usually kept me on a pretty strict sleeping schedule. I was sitting at my desk, watching an episode of Scrubs as I wound down for the night. That passive sort of watch that you do when you've seen every episode in the show a dozen times, or so. It was the one about JD's 30th birthday. Not that it's important. I was scrolling through something on my phone, and the show hit a commercial break. Being 2019, there wasn't a commercial. There was just 10 seconds of silence as it faded to black and back again. And that's when I heard it. It sounded like a single cry for help at first, coming from across the street, coming from the park. Definitely a woman's voice, almost passive though, like she'd only gotten lost and needed someone to respond to get her bearings straight. I put down my phone, took my headphones off, and stared out at the open window next to my desk. It almost didn't register at first, then it came again, this time harder, filled with pain and fear. Help. The sort of scream you hear when someone's running from something. My head started to spin. This was that moment that we all think we know how we're going to react. Pick up the phone, call the cops immediately, be called a hero in a blog, or get a lifetime supply of McDonald's by dropping a mention in an interview. But I didn't do any of that. I froze, had some dumb look on my face as the scream grew louder and louder, getting closer and closer to my building. When the adrenaline finally kicked in, I jumped up from the chair and looked out the window, down the 2 stories and along the street. It threw me off for a second. None of my neighbors' lights were on, almost like the whole street had gone dark, and the last bit of light for a mile was shining out of my window. The wails of this woman yanked me back into the moment. She was getting closer. At this point, she sounded like she was 50 feet away at best, maybe just past the trees at the trailhead, and for all I knew, I was the only person that was hearing any of this. I couldn't get an angle on her from just my window, so I thought I had to do something. I stomped my shoes on, fixed the stupid back on the right one that always gets caught under my heel, scrambled for my keys, and pocketed my phone in case I needed a flashlight. In those 20 seconds, I didn't notice it, but the screams had stopped. There was a low whimper instead, you know, like someone's holding back tears. I leaned to my window, and through a whimper she said, "I can see the light on. Please, can you help me?" There's no easy way to describe something that just sounds off, but what she said came across too calm. I've worked with enough people who call themselves actors to spot a bad performance. Look at it. You're running from something in the dark woods, and you finally escape only to collapse and start whimpering. Not only that, but you single out one person who might be there. No, you scream as loud as you can, until all the lights are on in the street, and you never stop running. I only thought of that later. Please, can you help me? She said it again, the same cadence. Not saying a word, I bolted out of my bedroom, through the apartment's front door, and was rushing down the hallway, through the building and to the front door. It was an open hallway, almost a long balcony that stretched the length of the building, letting people see directly into the park. As I rushed, I looked down the street to see that all of the lights were out, on that side as well. Hurry! Her cries were getting louder. No doubt she could hear me stomping toward my front door. I finally got to the door. My heart was pounding in my ears. I just want to go home, she wailed. It was so loud she had to be right on the other side of the door. I grabbed the doorknob, hovered my hand over the electric unlock button, and stopped. I was looking out the final stretch of hallway to the dark street again. That's when it hit me. My light was the only light on that night. To hell with a chill down my spine. My entire body went numb. I fell back, crashing into the mailboxes right inside the building's entrance. The closed door in front of me was all I could look at. I tried to speak, cry out for help of my own, but I couldn't. Open the door, please. There was a mix of anger and desperation in her voice now. I know you're there. Open the door. The knob turned, only to clack against the locks. Open it now. The knob nearly cracking, as whatever was on the other side started to pound on the door as well. An awful, wet beating sound ringing out with every hit. I still couldn't move. Tears built up in my eyes, because for all I knew, this was it. And as quickly as it all started, it stopped. I stayed there on the ground, waiting for another pound on the door, or the knob to turn again, but it didn't. I grabbed the grooved steel of the mailboxes and hoisted myself up, wiped the budding tears out of my eyes, and slowly backed away from the front door. Before I knew it, I was backing down the open hallway and could see out into the park. A heavy feeling in my chest overcame me. I could feel something watching me. Help. The same distant help that started this all, except this time, I knew it was for me. I continued backing down the hallway, clutching at the railing. Then, a hand slid over mine on the railing and spun me around. I had to have blacked out for a moment, because the next thing I knew, I was staring at my older neighbor who lives in the apartment next to me in the face, the wrinkles on his brow furrowed. Hasn't anyone told you? Lights out past 2. A stern, annoyed statement. Like I was the idiot for not knowing. He grumbled to himself and shuffled back into his apartment. Trying to keep me up all night? He said as he shut the door on my dumbfounded face. Mouth open, I turned to the park. The sinking feeling in my chest grew. The darkness between the trees silent until I heard a laugh. Had to have been hers. Then, another laugh. And another. Cackling howls erupted from the dark, all pointed at me. Whatever that was, there was more than one of them out there. I ran back to my apartment and immediately turned my bedroom light off. I slammed the window shut and threw myself onto my bed. Slept for maybe 3 hours all of last night. At least, I'll be able to sleep tonight, right on past 2. I've got 10 months of this lease, then I'm out of here. I'll move to downtown if I have to. I just never want to see the woods again. To preface, I'm a junior English major at a somewhat nice public college in Massachusetts. Despite some initial difficulties between myself and my overbearing parents regarding the level of control in our relationship, I've managed to make an independent life here, a healthy amount of distance from family, and a decent job at a certain coffee chain, as well as a fun setup by my parents, at least a decade before I was born, allow me to live comfortably on campus. I get overall average to good grades, even making Dean's List a few times over. While not exactly popular, I wasn't friendless, and being a lesbian was never a social problem for me. My life is, or more appropriately, was average and nondescript, but surprisingly lucky. I'd probably go into writing, as my early discovery of the creepypasta and no-sleep communities at the ripe age of 12 pushed me toward the goal of being the next King or Bright. What I've witnessed and experienced over the past few months has put any story's draft or plot idea of mine to shame. The college I attend, which I have chosen not to name for fear that someone reading this will decide to examine the details of my account more closely despite the danger presented, is at least 150 years old. Most of the buildings on campus are either from the 70s, old brutalist things, or recently built within the last 10 years. The newer buildings themselves are steel and glass, either built from the shells of the older halls or constructed over their demolished rubble. During my time here, I've seen several of the modern glass buildings go up. I've also had more than a few classes in them. I knew most of them particularly well. I had never before noticed the ladders. On my way to anthropology, a class held in one of the newer buildings on campus, I noticed the stairway I'd typically take to the third floor was inaccessible by way of a locked door and a wet floor sign sitting in front of it. Noticing the slow steam of liquid I assumed to be water trickle from under the door's seam, I decided to just walk to the other stairwell at the other side of the building. Considering I wasn't one to take the elevator for 2 flights of stairs, if I could help it, I simply took the other set of stairs. Almost an autonomous decision, but one that would change my life nonetheless. On autopilot, I climbed the stairs while checking my phone for texts from my girlfriend. For the purposes of privacy, I'll be calling her Julia. Once I reached the top of the stairs, I had also finished reading my most recent texts, checking the most recent no-sleep stories, mundane stuff. It was then that I noticed the first ladder, the one seen in the embedded image. I took a picture because I knew that this ladder had not been in the stairwell a few days before, and I was now prepared to be that person in every horror story who forgets to collect any sort of evidence. I like to think I was smarter than that. I tried to put the ladder out of my mind as I took my usual spot in the back of anthropology class. A good friend of mine, who I'll call Ethan, tapped me on the shoulder almost the moment I sat down, and I jumped just a little. He needled me on being a whole 5 minutes late before noticing the bewildered and dazed look across my face, an expression of slight concern overtaking his. "What, you forget to finish the paper? Just ask the professor for an extension. I'm sure it'll be fine." I asked him if he had noticed the ladder in the stairwell, and he nodded slowly, as if I'd asked him if the sky was blue. "You mean the service ladder? Yeah, it's been there forever. At least since the building opened. I think the maintenance crew uses it to get onto the roof." I accepted this explanation for the rest of the day. The lecture is partially tuned out of a more pressing concern. Passing in the stairwell on my way back from anthropology, I told myself the ladder was exactly what Ethan said it was, trying to accept that it had been a coincidence that I had never seen the mysterious ladder before, and that I was working myself up over nothing. When I met Julie over dinner last night, in one of the more decent restaurants on campus, I brought my apparent ladder-centric lapse in memory up as an anecdote, to which my girlfriend of 3 years told me that she had never seen the ladder in question before. "The maintenance guys have their own staircase, babe. It's in a room marked roof access. If they use the ladder, I've never seen it." This struck me as a little odd, of course, but I wouldn't let it ruin dinner with my girlfriend. We went back to my room together, and I once again put the thought of the ladder in the back of my mind. I knew she had an art history class in the same building, but I also hadn't specified which staircase the ladder was in. She had probably thought I was talking about the one which had been flooded, I assumed, rationalizing my own concerns over the discrepancies in accounts. Of course, the ladder's presence still gnawed at me. I asked any acquaintances who I knew had classes in the ladder building, and was met with a rough split between people who acted as though the ladder was always a part of that stairwell. The others seemed to have no idea as to what I was talking about. This discrepancy bothered me even more, so I finally flagged down a janitor, walking down the hallway towards the stairwell the alleged ladder was housed in. She chuckled for a moment, asking me if I was joking around. There couldn't be a ladder there, she explained, as it would be sealed off by the solid concrete and then roof. The ladder would lead to nowhere. The issue I held with the rusted ladder and the hatch at its top, which apparently couldn't open, came to a head a few days later. I decided, against the nervous urgings from Julia to do nothing of the sort, to try climbing the ladder. I, knowing that I'd probably be reprimanded, at least slightly by doing this in broad daylight, waited until the building was supposed to be closed for the evening. As much as I'd like to not admit it, I hid in the bathroom, standing atop a toilet seat. When I knew no one would catch me on the ladder, that may or may not be, I left the bathroom stall, making my way to the hall where I'd find the objective waiting for me. The ladder, sure enough, hung from the ceiling with an eerie rigidity. It was as though no one had climbed it in a few months, and upon closer inspection, was caked with rust. Putting thoughts of tetanus out of my mind, I ascended the ladder, making sure I didn't make any noise doing so. Getting to the top wasn't nearly as much of a task as I'd assumed it would be, and I found myself able to pull the hatch holding the heavy metal door fastened down. I climbed a few more steps, 3, maybe, finding myself on eye level with what looked like a hallway. Utility pipes lining the walls, some broken and leaking what I hoped was water. I tried to pull myself up onto this floor, which shouldn't be, only to find myself at the bottom of the ladder, as though I'd only just begun the climb. I promptly got the hell out of there, my itching curiosity replaced with a primal fear. It didn't stop there. Once I decided that I must have been seeing things, most likely a gap between the supposed concrete layer and the ceiling panels, life quickly returned to normalcy. I'd forgotten and lost interest in the strange ladder in the history building. I like to think that some part of me, deep down, decided that the risk of exploring that space above the ladder was not worth what I'd find there. Like most experiences with the unknown, it didn't stop there. A few months after my first ladder experience, as I'd jokingly called it among my close friends, I started noticing it again. In fact, the ladder was hard not to notice. It was in a completely different building, across campus, but still in its position at the top of a stairwell. I tried to rationalize the situation. Whoever designed the campus had simply placed similar maintenance ladders in different locations, but the sense of dread peeking in the pit of my stomach told me that something was deeply amiss. I didn't bring this ladder up, for fear of appearing delusional towards what was, more than likely, a completely normal service ladder, but I internally worried I was going insane. Something unknowable kept telling me that it was the same ladder, copy-pasted into a different location. And of course, others. I've seen it in the bookstore, in the dorm stairwell, in the women's bathroom. I have seen the ladder in places it should not feasibly be, such as its rusted frame and trap door sprouting from the tennis court. I felt as though I was going insane. Any questions about the ladder being met with similar responses to my initial survey? They had simultaneously always been, and never had been. I stopped seeing my friends after a while, the only person I truly trusted being Julia. During winter break, I stayed with her and her family, a welcome addition to their annual Hanukkah festivities. Finally, for the first time in months, I felt truly safe from my inanimate stalker. One night, however, I was sitting in the host's living room, Julia asleep and draped with blankets by my side, a cup of tea in one hand and a good book in the other. I got up to dim the lights at least a little, temporarily removing the family cat from my lap. It was when I got to the other side of the room that I saw it, where the fireplace should have been, the ladder. I didn't really believe in supernatural anything until I cursed myself a week ago. I'm hoping someone here who's more in tune with this sort of thing, or knows more about the paranormal, can help me. I'm terrified, and I don't know where else to turn. Nobody in my actual life believes me. Okay, to start off, I'm 21, and had just moved into my own apartment a month ago. It's a nice place, and I know the area itself has nothing to do with what's happening. It's my own damn fault. So, what happened is a couple friends and I, Mark and Dave, went out to the local cemetery at night to freak ourselves out. I'd grown up in this town and only moved out of my parents' place, so I knew the area and where we would be going. This place was really creepy on its own, even during the day. Most of the graves are really old, some of them even falling apart and crumbling. The majority of the graves are Civil War soldiers, if that tells you how old they really are, but I think a few date back to even before then, though I'm not entirely sure. I've never actually been to the place before the incident. I've only ever walked past it a few times, usually trying to avoid it entirely, since it's more nearing the outskirts of town and is guarded by a tall, iron rod fence. Not to mention the legend of the psycho murderer groundskeeper. But that's a story for a different time, and it's only a legend anyway. The real stuff happened when my friends and I went to the cemetery. It was almost midnight when we got there, flashlights and phones ready to make dumb videos and give each other a good scare. Mark was driving and parked right outside the black gate. He didn't really think anybody would come by and catch us, as nobody really ever even neared the place after dark, so we weren't worried about the red car being out in the open. We exited the car and came to a stand at the gate, our flashlights and phones lights shining all over its towering structure. Of course, it was padlocked shut with a slightly rusted chain, but that wouldn't stop us. I had brought a couple tools to pick the lock with. I only knew how to because of seeing it in movies and stuff, and wanting to seem cool in my high school days. It didn't take long to persuade the lock open and swing the gates open with a stereotypical shriek of old metal. This is where the real story begins. We stepped inside and onto the cracked, paved path, following it along down the rows of decrepit tombstones. Our lights shone everywhere, going over practically every stone we passed by. Finally, once we were about 100 feet in, we deviated from the path and started going through the slightly overgrown grass. This place really wasn't well taken care of, psycho groundskeeper or not. Hey, check this one out. Dave beckoned from ahead. He crouched in front of a particularly old headstone that was half falling apart, a good chunk of the top of it missing. We shone our lights on it and crouched, too, to read. Half the name was missing from it being broken, but we could mostly make out Amin Lon. January 1843 to October 1861. Some of his last name was too rubbed and faded away to make out. Benjamin something, but it looks like he died when he was only 18. You think he was in the war? Dave asked, and glanced at us. Probably. The headstone looks like it could definitely be from that time, and 1861 is when the war started, Mark replied. He was more of a history buff, so he would know more than we would about it. Man, that would suck to die so young, I said as I stood up. I turned and shone my light around, then started walking some more, going further in. My buddies followed, and while we were walking, Dave suddenly screamed. I honestly jumped at this, and spun around to see Mark laughing his ass off. Obviously, he had just scared Dave, probably by grabbing him suddenly or something. Dave scowled and punched Mark in the shoulder rather hard, but Mark only continued to laugh. Nice one, was all I said with a smile and small chuckle of my own. More just disappointed I hadn't witnessed it myself, because I had been in the lead. I turned back after that, and continued to walk and scan graves with my flashlight. Most of them I saw didn't even have names or dates on them, just totally unmarked, besides a small slab of stone jutting from the ground. Looks like Benjamin was the lucky one to get an actual headstone. I muttered as we walked. Mark and Dave followed along behind after recovering from their little prank. Well, a lot of families back then couldn't afford to have nice headstones once the war started, Mark chimed in. And the two armies didn't really have time or resources to make proper graves for their fallen. Benjamin's family was probably pretty wealthy to get him an actual headstone. That'd be sad, Dave said. I can't imagine not at least getting a decent gravestone when I die eventually. Well, it happened a lot back then. Still happens today sometimes, but that's pretty rare. Might have to become a vengeful spirit after and hunt everybody then if I don't. Dave joked, lightening up easily. He's always been a pretty laid-back kind of guy, at least when he's not being pranked. I looked at the two over my shoulder with a dumb idea, and I'm sure the grin on my face mirrored that. We should totally do a spirit session, you know, like a seance. Of course, I didn't believe in any of that, and neither did my friends, but we were dumb and thought it would be funny. I don't really need to go into detail about this too much, as nothing actually happened paranormal-wise, obviously. We just sat around among the graves in a circle with our flashlights and phones, making jokes and being stupid college guys. We even recorded it all. But the footage isn't important here. What is important is the absolute dumbass thing I did that I thought would be funny on camera. With Mark filming, I got up and went over to a tall headstone, one of those ones that's an angel. It was one of the very few that was actually more than a simple slab of rock. It was still crumbling, but looked sturdy enough, so I climbed onto it, acting like King Kong as I held on to one of the arms and made obnoxious noises. I then, of course, boasted that I was the bravest of all of us and dared any ghost to come at me. Nothing happened, and I was about to jump off the stone when the arm I was holding onto broke off at the elbow. I fell onto my ass, on the ground. The arm piece landed next to me, thankfully not hurting me at all. For a moment, I couldn't believe what had just happened, and sat there, staring at the broken arm piece next to me in shock. Mark was still filming and panned the camera from the arm to me, as I looked up at him and Dave. "Dude, this is not okay," Mark said, worried. Dave piped up then, equally as concerned. "We're gonna get in so much trouble for this." I finally snapped out of the shock and got up quickly, dusting myself off briefly. "No, we're not," I told them more firmly. Inside, I was panicking just like they were, but I couldn't let them know that. Who's going to know? Nobody knows we're out here. And if we just leave now, then no one will ever find out it was us. "What do you mean us?" Mark questioned, still holding his phone up and taking video. "You're the one who decided it was a good idea to climb on it. Do you know how disrespectful that is? It's one thing to come in here exploring, but it's another to climb on and break someone's final resting place." I took out my hand and pushed his phone down. Not hard to knock it out of his hands, but enough to keep the camera off me now. "It doesn't matter. Let's just get out of here," I told him, and walked quickly back to the entrance. They followed, but I heard Dave from behind me say, "I'm sorry," followed by Mark doing the same. I assumed they were talking to the graves, even though they believed in the paranormal about as much as I did. Just like that, we locked the place back up and then left in the car. The rest of the night was uneventful, but the next morning I did wake up to my apartment being really cold. Like, freezer cold. I checked all the windows for a sudden draft, but there was nothing, and they were shut and locked tight. The AC was off too, and my door was also locked. There was no real reason for my place to be so cold. I checked out in the hall even, poking my head out, but it was a normal autumn temperature outside my door. A bit chilly, but not this cold. Opening a window and sticking my arm out yielded the same results, so it was only my apartment that was freezing for some unknown reason. The best I could do was turn the heat on while I ate breakfast, to make it a little more comfortable before school. I went to my college classes like usual, and came back to the place feeling like normal temperature again. It was weird, but I just shrugged it off as some freak thing with the atmosphere and building. The rest of the day was normal besides that, until night came. It was maybe around 10 p.m. while I was doing some late homework at the dining table, when I heard a knock at my door. It was a normal kind of knock, not too fast or slow or soft or loud, just 3 average knocks. Obviously, I was still immediately suspicious, because who knocks on your door at 10 at night? Still, I got up and went over to it. It was locked, since I was always told to have your doors locked at all times, and I didn't want to risk anything in case some crazy druggie or weirdo was at the door. So I just peered out the peephole, but I didn't see anything. Just empty hallway with brightly lit lights, but nobody else in sight. It was weird. But I shrugged it off and went back to my table to finish up the homework. Not even a minute later, another 3 knocks at my door, same as before. I got up again, and looked out the peephole to see no one there. Again, I went back to the table, but this time it came again as soon as I sat down. This time, they were a little more rapid and urgent sounding. I was getting irritated by this, and half stomped over to the door and looked out the hole once more. Nothing. I waited by the door for a few minutes after that, just waiting to hear the knocks again so I could yank the door open and find whoever was pranking me. I was sure it had to be a prank by that time, but nothing else happened. Not while I was standing ready, anyway. But the moment I turned back to go to my table, thinking it was over, 3 more urgent knocks on my door. I spun back around and unlocked the deadbolt and click lock quickly, then ripped the door open, ready to give whoever was messing with me a piece of my mind. But nobody was there. I looked up and down the long stretch of hallway on both sides and saw no one. My neighbors' doors were closed, and I hadn't heard any other doors opening or closing, so I don't think it was any of them. If it was, then they're really fast and quiet. I took one last glance up and down each of the hallway before shutting and locking my door again. I stood there for a moment, trying to figure out who could have been messing with me and how, but after a minute, I decided finishing my homework and getting to bed was more important. I went back to the table, half expecting to hear those knocks again once I sat down, but they didn't come. The rest of the night was quiet, and I finished my homework, tucked it into my backpack, then went to bed. The next morning I woke up to my homework papers strewn about all over my bedroom floor, some of them torn in half. I jumped out of bed, scared that somebody had broken in, and I grabbed my old baseball bat from when I played in middle school. I'd had it sitting on a shelf as a nice memento, but it was going to potentially protect me now. I checked the entire apartment first for intruders, looking under the bed and in the closet and shower, even in the sink cupboards. As I'm sure you can expect by now, I didn't find anyone. The locks on the door and window were next, and none had been unlocked or tampered with. I'm not afraid to admit that this all shook me up a bit, but I gathered up the messy papers regardless and went to class like any other day. Again, the rest of the day was normal, even when I came home. Nothing else was out of place, and it stayed that way for the next day. But after that full day of inactivity, the next to follow really shook me. It was dark again, and I was eating a late dinner at the same table I'd done my homework at before. I'll admit that I was a little buzzed after having been drinking with Mark and Dave earlier, but I was still not entirely drunk. Not enough to hallucinate anyway. By the way, I didn't mention the strange happening to them, and they didn't mention any to me, so no need to ask. Anyway, I was at the table, chowing down on the miracle food of all broke college students, ramen noodles, when my phone, which I had been watching videos on, dies. No big deal, and not weird by any means. I simply sighed and set it aside for the time being, too lazy to get up while in the middle of my makeshift meal to plug it in. That's not the strange part. The strange part came a couple minutes later, as knocking broke the silence now engulfing me and my home. But it wasn't coming from the door this time. This time, it came from the fire escape window in my living room. I sat frozen for a bit, staring in the direction of the sound. There was a small section of wall blocking my view of the window from where I sat, so I couldn't see anything. But I heard the knocking come again. It was like the same type of knocking on my door from 2 days ago. The most stereotypical, normal knocks ever. When I didn't move to investigate, scared it really was some type of junkie or insane person, the knocking grew more frantic again, like before. Knock, knock, knock. Pause. More rapid knocking. Pause. Increasingly frantic knocking. It became more and more panicked and rapid until it was flat out continuous pounding on my window. I picked up my phone to call the police, but it was still dead. So I did the only thing I really could do. I grabbed a knife from my kitchen drawer and shakily crept up behind the wall separating my view from the window. It took a moment to psych myself up for it, but I eventually jumped out from behind the wall with the knife in hand to look threatening, and to feel safer, expecting to see a crazed homeless person or someone like that at my window. No one. Again, no one. The noise stopped as soon as I rounded the corner too. Confusion overtook me as I stared out at the dark night. Lights from the town and other buildings illuminated the fire escape a little, shining off the metal and showing that nobody was there. Even when I went to the window and looked out, and down to make sure no one was trying to hide in the small space under it, there was still nobody. The thing about the fire escape, or any metal fire escape, is that they're noisy. If someone is moving around on one, you're going to hear them if you're nearby. It's just a fact, because the metal creaks and bends and slides, but I hadn't heard a thing. Even if it wasn't a thing, I would have seen whoever was banging on my window, because the pounding stopped the moment I jumped out from behind the wall. There would have been absolutely no time for anyone, no matter how quick you are, to have escaped my sight in that little of time. Needless to say, I was thoroughly freaked out for the night. I made sure the window was still locked and took my phone and the rest of my noodles to my bedroom, where I shut the door and even pushed my dresser in front of it a little, just in case. I plugged in my phone and started watching videos again while eating from the safety of my blanket in bed. I fell asleep at some point and woke up the next morning. At first, things seemed normal with no papers all over the place, and everything in my room seeming to be in order. Except, that was the problem. Everything was exactly the way it should have been, including my dresser being back in its place, in the corner of my room. I freaked out for a few minutes and checked the house with my bat again, finding nothing out of the ordinary and everything still locked up tight. I had to rationalize that I had simply dreamt of moving my dresser in front of the door, but hadn't actually done it. Because how could I have done it, for it only to be where it was supposed to be, in the corner of the room again, with no other explanation? Even so, I took my breakfast to go and headed out the door without looking back. I'd just get to class early and eat on the way. Hopefully things would be normal after that. Maybe all this was from stress brought on by the hard classes, and some guilt from breaking that tombstone anyway. I just needed to relax, so that's what I did. After classes ended for the day, Dave and I went around town, shopping for new video games, eating out at fast food places a couple of times, and just generally wandering the town. It was a fun time. The only thing that would have made it more fun was if Mark would have come, but he had to spend time with his family, which was understandable since his little sister was in the hospital. It was nothing serious, just getting her tonsils out and having to stay for a while after due to some other minor medical issues. She's fine now, by the way. After all the fun and having purchased the latest Call of Duty for PS4, I headed back to my apartment like normal, at around 8 p.m. By then, the sun was finally going down, so it was more or less dusk, but not full on dark out yet. I entered, locked the door behind me like always, and then went to my room to unpack and play my new game. I'd only just put the disc into my PS4 when I started to hear what sounded like whispering. The funny thing was, it didn't sound like it was coming from any one spot in the room or outside. It sounded like it was all around me, surrounding me, but it was all one voice. The same voice with the same angry tone. I don't know what it was saying though. I couldn't make that out. Instead of being scared like the little baby I had been for the past few days, I decided to chalk it up to a draft of the wind outside and ignore it. This explanation didn't make sense, since I had checked for drafts before when it was freezing and found nothing, and the wind hadn't been blowing at all when I was outside, but that was the best, rational explanation I had, so I went with it, deciding it was fine. The game was fun when I started to actually play, and I soon forgot about the angry whispering around me until it simply wasn't there anymore. Looking at the clock, I'd been playing for 3 hours, having lost complete track of time. But that's what happens when you're playing a really fun game. I got ready for bed and snuggled under the blanket, shutting off my light. I had fallen asleep but woke up in the middle of the night abruptly. At first, I had no idea why I had woken up so suddenly. The night was still, and it wasn't cold or anything. I looked at my alarm clock, and it read 2:23 a.m. Looking around the room, I saw nothing out of the ordinary, but then I heard it, knocking. 3 normal knocks. Only this time, it wasn't coming from my door or a window. It was coming from under my bed. Someone was knocking on my bed from underneath. With it soon came a deep, raspy voice that sounded like an old recording almost. It said to me, just loud enough to be heard above the knocking, "I don't like you." I sat there frozen in fear for what seemed like forever, until the knocking grew more frantic like it always had, steadily getting more and more rapid and forceful. Finally, I snapped out of terror enough to grab my phone from the nightstand, and I stood up on my bed. In one bound, I jumped off my bed and cleared most of the tiny bedroom. I flung the bedroom door open and ran outside, into the hall. Looking back, I had to unlock the door with trembling hands, so no one came in that way. From the hall, I called the police, fast walking down the hall to the elevator, all the while looking over my shoulder and staring at my unmoving door, just waiting for someone to burst through it and run at me. That didn't happen, and I stayed by the elevator, ready to push the button if it did, but unwilling to leave so whoever was in my apartment couldn't escape through the door without me seeing them. The police arrived within minutes, and went to my apartment, pistols ready. I waited out in the hall with one of them, anxiously waiting for the 2 officers who went inside to drag some meth head, screaming, out in handcuffs. After a few minutes, the 2 emerged from the apartment, empty-handed. "We couldn't find anyone in the home," one of them told me, a look of annoyance on his face. "And every window was locked. There's no signs of a break-in at all." He paused, frowning at me. "Next time you call us with a false alarm again, we'll bring you in." With that, he and his partner walked away. The one cop who had been standing out in the hall with me gave me a sympathetic look. She had seen how distraught and terrified I was, how anxiously I was waiting while her squad members were searching my apartment. She knew I wasn't faking it. "Give us a call if it happens again, but for now, I suggest you get a friend to take you in for a bit, to cool down some," she told me, then walked away, following her partners. I could only watch as they left, still shaking and not wanting to go back inside that apartment, but I had to. I briefly went back inside to grab my keys, a couple clothes, my backpack, and phone charger, then locked the place up and left. I called Dave twice before he groggily picked up, and by the time he had, I was already parked outside his house. I told him what was up, and that I had to crash at his place for a few days to ease my nerves. I didn't say that a mysterious whatever had been terrorizing me though. I just said that someone had broken in, and that they fled before the police could get there. He readily agreed to let me stay with him for a bit, and he came down to unlock the door and let me in. Those few nights were rather uneventful. However, I did hear a few thumps at nights here and there, but I assumed it was just his pit bull roaming the house. She's a really sweet dog, but she's big, and tends to be clumsy, so I wouldn't be surprised if it was her bumping into things in the dark. The random bumps at night were unnerving, sure, but it was nothing compared to when I was at my own place. Eventually, I did have to go back to my apartment though. I had to grow a pair and suck it up. The night I went back, I was so on edge. Every little sound made me jump, and I couldn't get to sleep easily once the time came. I did fall into a restless sleep at some point, and woke up with a nasty headache. Basically, I felt like I'd been hit by a bus. That kind of morning. Still, it was quiet and normal. Nothing unusual or scary happened, and nothing like that happened the following night either. It was last night that things really escalated, and it's the whole reason I'm typing this all out here. This is something I really can't explain, no matter how hard I try, or how much I want to say I'm just going insane from stress at school, or guilt, or whatever. None of it makes sense. Last night, I was in my bed and about to fall asleep when I heard that knocking again. It was softer and distant, definitely coming from my front door. However, instead of starting off normal and rhythmic like all the times before, it was already frantic and aggressive pounding. My bedroom door was shut, and I had a lock installed on it, another deadbolt like the one on my front door. That was in place, and I had my bat ready in my hands the moment I realized what was going on. I scooted my back against the headboard and wall, eyes transfixed on the door like at any moment it would burst open. But something worse happened. The banging on my door stopped. I didn't hear it open, and I didn't hear it being knocked down, but somehow, something got in. Yes, something. I am 100% certain now that whatever is tormenting me is not human. It can't be. Because after a few agonizing moments of silence, that stereotypical normal knocking happened, now on my bedroom door, and I could see the shadowed outline of feet from the crack under it. The figure darker than the normal darkness around it. It knocked 3 times, then paused, then knocked again. This time, a lot more slowly. It was as if the thing was taunting me. It stopped for another minute, but the darker shadows underneath the door didn't move. It was just standing there, staring at the door. I stared back clutched tightly in my hands, and knees to my chest with the blanket over them. In the silence, I finally realized to call 911 again, and so I did. Phone in one hand and bat in the other, I continued to watch the door as that thing stood there in front of it. When the man on the other end picked up, the panic really set in. I said loudly in a trembling voice that somebody was in my apartment, and right outside my bedroom door, and to send police right away. I was hoping that by saying this loudly, it would scare whoever was outside my door away, but they didn't move. Instead, they spoke, in that raspy, deep voice that could not have been human. It said to me, "I don't like you." The 911 dispatch man must have heard it too, because he told me officers were on their way, and to just sit tight with any sort of protection I had, and to stay on the line with him. His own voice sounded a little more urgent. I said nothing back, only whispered in response as the slow, melodic knocking came again, not ending at 3 this time, but continuing on. Slow and steady like the lazy beat of a drum. After what seemed like forever, it finally stopped, and the shadow of the feet moved away as if the thing was leaving. I didn't hear the door still, but a small rush of relief washed over me. That is, until I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I felt the presence of someone right beside me. I didn't even have time to turn before that old recording of a voice whispered into my ear. The face close enough to feel their breath on my skin and send chills down my spine. Disrespectful cretin. Without thinking, my head turned, and in the very dim light of my alarm clock, I saw its face. Half of it shrouded in shadow. I saw the face of what appeared to be a soldier from centuries ago, but his skin was rotting. He was a corpse. His skin gray or green and falling off, exposing bone in places and just barely hanging on in others. The eye that I could see was fogged over, like steamed up glass, and he wore a very dirty and battered dark blue cap. I didn't notice anything about his body, but that half-shadowed face is burned into my memory forever, a mental scar that will never heal. I screamed at the top of my lungs, so loud I'm sure everyone in the entire building could hear me. The bat left my hand, not even taking a swing at the corpse man, as I jumped up and raced to my bedroom door. I tore open the lock and booked it out of there, somehow still managing to hold onto my phone as I hauled ass out of the building entirely. I went to my car and locked myself in, checking the back seat just in case, before curling up into a ball in the driver's seat and sobbing like a baby. All the while, I was still on the line with the 911 dispatcher, and he tried to calm me down after ensuring I was safe in my locked car. Police came soon after and stormed my apartment. Of course, they found nothing unusual, besides the bent lock on my bedroom door. Yeah, I had been so terrified and frantic to get out that I bent a deadbolt a little. Thankfully, the officers were different this time, so I didn't get arrested for another false report. I called Dave again after they left, still sitting in my car, and I asked if I could stay over for a few more nights again. The really scary thing is that while I talked to him, I looked up in my apartment window from my car, and the light turned on. Then, I saw that same zombie soldier appear and look right down at me. He waved slowly, and the light went out after another couple seconds. I'm ashamed to admit in this whole adventure that I'd wet my pants, but anybody would in this situation, right? It doesn't matter. I'm at Dave's house again, writing this all on my phone from his couch. Every single light is on right now, even though it's only 9 p.m., and Dave is sitting right next to me playing his own PS4. His dog, Rosie, is sleeping at his feet too. I feel a lot safer right now, but I'm terrified for night to come. I don't think it'll come from me here, since it didn't before, but I don't know. I don't want to think it'll take the chance. Dave still doesn't know everything that's happened. Not the paranormal aspect of it. It has to be paranormal, right? How else does any of this happen? Nothing makes sense, and I've never been this scared in my life. Mark knows some of it, and he suggested we go back to the cemetery to apologize to the graves about what I did, specifically the one I broke. It sounds stupid, and I know he doesn't even believe that what's going on is paranormal, or has to do with ghosts, but I know he's trying to suggest something to give me some sort of closure in all this. He's a good friend like that. Still, I'm hesitant to go back to that place anyway, where I'm sure it all started. What if the corpse soldier is there? What if he comes after me where there aren't any walls, or doors to separate us, or police to come running? I know he got into my room once, but it still feels like I'll be a lot more vulnerable outside. I don't know what to do. I'm so scared and I want it all to stop. I'm convinced this thing isn't within reason or logic or science. That's why I'm here, asking you guys who know about the supernatural. Please, can you guys help me? What should I do? I need this all to stop.